Let's talk about heroes, commanders, foul despots and mighty demons, with some thoughts on the best leader for every Warhammer 40k faction. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking characters and HQ choices, talking through each army in the game in turn, and one or more of the character choices that tends to get played most often in competitive lists for that faction. For some armies out there, I feel like the choice of leader is a lot more balanced than others. I feel like picking a best one was really easy for some factions, though kind of hard to impossible for others. So for each one I'll try and focus on at least one strong character which I think has some claim to fame for the throne, and then go through a list of other things that might be challenging them for the title. First up, we've got the standard issue Codex Space Marines, and for this one I decided to go with the Gladius Task Force and a Lieutenant or Apothecary Biologist with the Fire Discipline Enhancement. Obviously this one's detachment specific, but given that Gladius along with the Vanguard detachment tend to be the most commonly played in grand tournaments, I think it's reasonable enough and certainly gives you a whole load of bang for your buck. This one's pretty well tried and tested at this point. Either take a Lieutenant or an Apothecary Biologist for 65 points or 55, and then give them Fire Discipline and the command of Bolt Storm Aggressors or Hellblasters and deliver them into range somehow. Other units certainly could work as well. I've seen some people use it with Eradicators too, though these two would probably be my go-to picks. To get them into range, you could use something like a Land Raider or a Repulsor, or maybe some sort of chapter-specific teleport style option like Uriel Ventress. And then you've got a scary unit that has both lethal and sustained hits at base on a 6+, so a little bit more dangerous than normal. Then you activate Devastator Doctrine in Gladius, either for your 1 free turn of it or with a stratagem, and then both of those critical hit things go off on a 5+, and target them on your Oath of Moment unit, and you reroll everything that isn't a 5+, so that just drowns the enemy in an enormous amount of auto wounds and extra hits. If you need it, you can also throw in Storm of Fire as well. That could give you some extra AP and ignoring cover. Between all that, you've just got some fairly obscene damage that breaks the normal maths, and not really too much surprise that it's an auto-include in Gladius, never mind anything that the unit might go on to achieve in melee after that. Aggressors can certainly hit pretty hard there as well. Obviously that one's detachment specific though, so for plenty of other things, a couple of the Ultramarines characters are really stand out. Marnius Calgar might cost 185 points but is pretty immense. I could have pretty happily ranked him top as well. He generates command points, gets extra models in the unit with those Victrix Honor Guards, and is just all around pretty mighty. Uriel Ventress can teleport a unit, setting up something really nasty in Deep Strike, and then run around with some Assault Intercessors or Company Heroes as a beatstick character. Then beyond that, lots of the more standard Space Marine characters are really viable. Tech Marines if you've got a nice vehicle or Dreadnought to buff, maybe the Gravis Captain in Firestorm to help out some Flamestorm aggressors, perhaps the Combi Weapon Lieutenant as an annoying lone operative that most armies will struggle to catch up with. Plenty of solid options out there for the Space Marines. Before we move on, I thought I'd just quickly give a shout out to today's video sponsor in Baron of Dice. They've recently produced some rather swanky custom channel dice for Auspex Tactics, and when they did they also asked if they could sponsor a few videos, given that they've got a good reputation for making luxury dice that just so happen to be compatible with quite a few armies and factions in various wargames out there, including 40k. They've got a pretty enormous range of dice, and as we go through the video I'll put a few in the corner of each slide as we go along. They do generally seem to have a pretty good reputation for the dice themselves, a good feel to them, and generally having good feedback that they tend to roll well. I'm certainly impressed with what he came out with for the channel dice. Here are the Auspex Tactics ones. Incidentally, they're also linked down in the video description. I do like the good job that he did with the little bit of green in the logo on the 6. In any case though, for his more regular offerings, you'll find them linked down in the video description, or £26 for 25 dice, certainly on the slightly more luxury end of the market. They still seem to be beating out Games Workshop at least on the per dice price. They're based in the USA and ship worldwide. It can add a bit to the expense if you're outside of the USA, and it's given me a code Auspex to get 5% off any order through them if you did look to pick something up. In any case, a big thank you for sponsoring the video. The link will be down in the video description. In any case, let's return to some faction commanders then, and next up for the AdMech, it's hard not to rank the Skitarii Marshal in the top spot, just 35 points to make a Rangers or Vanguard squad significantly more dangerous. They tend to be a really relevant HQ for the faction, given that the vast majority of competitive armies tend to be playing Hunter cohort, heavily focused around the Skitarii units themselves with some cool buffs available to them, and plus battle line units in general are just super relevant for AdMech, giving the boosted version of the Doctriners, particularly the extra AP in the Conqueror Doctriner. For the Marshal himself, he's 35 points, and just has a very cheap support character kind of profile with a few attacks at strength 6 and AP 1 in melee. The big thing he adds is rerolling hits for his unit, which does genuinely make Vanguard and Rangers a lot more dangerous with their various special weapons and can tear up some light or medium infantry. That's even nicer now they could either be Ballistic Skill 3+ on the move or get the extra AP and Assault from Conqueror Doctrine. Beyond that, there's a once per game cancel battle shock that he's got access to, which could be useful in a pinch for certain units that you desperately needed to use a stratagem on. And also he's pretty much the model in Hunter cohorts to bear the enhancements, and basically every single one of those is at least usable. Cantic Thrallnet went from good to godly given the Doctriner enhancement. Both having Conqueror and Protector all on the same unit is a serious stack of buffs. The Battlesphere on Blink is great for move shoot move shenanigans. It can infiltrate and scout, or redeploy 3 Skitarii units, all of those at a price tag that makes them interesting. I think I would rate him as the most standout. Plenty of other good ones though, like the Manipulus with Cataphrons, the Dominus is fine. Techno-archaeologists provide good support on objectives with their deep strike denials. Call can actually do a bit of work now, and Engineers can do work in a vehicle-heavy list like Cohort Cybernetica. Moving on, we've got the Golden Guardians of the Adeptus Custodes, and for that one I've chosen to rank the Blade Champion in the top spot for 110 points. He does seem to be the most commonly played single datasheet out of the lot of them post data slate. Just a nice uncomplicated mix of savage hitting power and getting his squad into melee, which is often half the battle with the Custodes. With his Vault Swords, he's often going to be using the heavy hitting 5 attacks at strength 6, AP 3 and damage 3 with devastating wounds, which is pretty helpful against a bunch of things that Guardian Spears fall down a little bit against. Though has 2 other options that he can vary on the target. He'll be getting the Martial Qatar buffs each turn, and if you're playing Shield Host, as a lot seem to be, then that's 1 further damage buff, extra criticals or extra AP. Once per game his unit gets to advance and charge, which is massive and adds loads to the unit's threat range, and he can always reroll charge rolls at base as well. So for that turn you'd have an increased threat range of around about say 4 or 5 inches or so, which can be pretty massive for an infantry squad usually moving around on foot. He can go with Custodian Guard, though seems to be perhaps particularly popular with Wardens. He brings nice damage and speed to the unit when they bring the solid defense. Otherwise, beyond him, the Shield Captains are far better now that their strats work in Shield Host, as they don't care about them being battle tactics anymore. And Kyria Draxus is worth a mention, at least prior to any sort of Agents of the Imperium update. Her shooting can get to rather godly levels with Custodian Guard with the double shooting and the damage boost that they bring, never mind any stratagems thrown into the mix. Next up, we've got the Knights of Titan, and for the Grey Knights I've ranked Caldor Drago in the top spot, 125 points. For the big and scary Supreme Grandmaster Lost in the Warp, a fairly cheap price tag, and he basically just brings getting his squad to melee and then hitting very hard when he gets there. On one of the turns, when they drop in from Deep Strike or Teleport, they get a plus 3 inches to their charge, so that's usually going to be a 6-inch charge, which is very likely to go off with a command point reroll budgeted. That pairs very nicely with Terminators as well, given that they get the lethal hits on the charge. His own melee has 6 attacks at strength 8, AP 4 and damage 3 with an anti-demon 2+ with his Titan Sword. Again, that'll enjoy lethal hits from the Terminators. And beyond that, he also has a helpful shooting attack with the Scouring. And his Mortal Wound debuff, where you get to ignore them on a 4+, is more relevant than it was before. Nice that it works against devastating wounds now. Beyond that, the Brotherhood Librarian's still a staple. Savage Mortal Wounds for 120 points. And the Grandmaster in Nemesis Dread Knight is a strong datasheet too. Dread Knights are sort of relevant to take down any tough targets out there. The Grandmaster version does have some disadvantages, but can make some great use of enhancements, and has some particularly nice rerolls in melee to take down the toughest stuff in the enemy army. For the Sisters of Battle, I think it was hard to rank anything else but the Triumph of St. Catherine here, 190 points for the slightly mad relic-bearing funeral procession, which went from pretty good to stand out amazing in the Codex, generating a miracle dice of a 6 each turn, which is just some spectacular reliability. They can be fed into anything from long charges to big damage hits with multi-melters, to automatic saves on the 6+ invulnerables, a huge amount of potential for that going off each battle round. That ability is worth a huge amount of points in itself, but beyond that the Triumph is a somewhat chunky and annoying to take out big base. 18 wounds with a 4+ invulnerable save means it's going to soak up at least a fair bit of volume fire or anti-tank, and it's got enough melee to sweep some sort of medium infantry units off the board with 18 attacks at strength 5 AP 2. Beyond that, it's got a whole massive choice of different great buffs it can give the units around it, A +2 to move and +1 to advance and charge is one of the very best. Slingshotting units right across the board, such as Immolators early game if you want. The double Axe of Faith can have some really interesting combos for multi-melters, particularly with a Dialogus on board. Reroll 1s to wound at range isn't going to be bad for castigators and things. The 6+ Feel No Pain just gives a bit of random extra defense both to itself and others, and extra AP in melee. Could be relevant for its own close combat against certain targets. Even the reroll Battle Shock one could be pretty impactful if it's late game and the only thing that matters is scoring objectives. Overall, maybe not too much surprised that this is basically in just about every competitive Sisters list. Otherwise though, Sisters are strong at the moment, and loads of their other units in the HQ section are really strong. More than Val plus Paragons have spectacular amounts of damage. The Dialogus can get some auto 6 miracles, or even just be fielded as a cheap annoying action doer. The Jump Pack Canoness with a bunch of Seraphim and Hand Flamers can be savage and bringers of flame, around 40 strength 5 hits with 3 devastating wounds on them with the Canoness. And Palatines are just nice for their lethal hits and their damage buff, and can be buffed to be surprisingly fighty in multiple different detachments. For the Imperial Guard, the common and boring answer is Lord Solar Leontus at 125 points. He's been utterly auto-include since the start of 10th edition, just given that he both generates huge command points and has 3 godly orders that can be broadcast via a platoon command squads to affect things like tank commanders, Bulgrin, or even super heavies if you want to. The whole setup is a bit on the pricey side, but still seems to appear in the vast majority of competitive lists. Beyond that, he also gets his redeploy rule, where you're able to shift some units around or put them in strategic reserve if it makes sense to. And beyond that, his damage and defensive stats aren't even terrible. Could certainly be a good force for helping repel some elite infantry that are trespassing in the deployment zone. A late game push with his squad for a bunch of OC in the mid-board could also be impactful once his commanding work is done. Otherwise for Guard HQs, we've already mentioned command squads really, often pairing with him. Gaunt's Ghosts are nice for skirmishing around with secondaries, doing actions and doing a whole bunch of chip damage, often being able to bully lighter infantry units. Ursula Creed can hand out some discounted fields of fire, and tank commanders just have good damage output and come with a tank order baked in. And if you want a Lehman Russ Demolisher, then often a tank commander could be the way to go over that, even if you do pass up the lethal hits from Born Soldiers. Their shoots on death is quite nasty as well. For the Knights, perhaps another unsurprising choice in Canis Rex here. Technically all of the big Titanic Knights are characters bar the Acastus, but Canis Rex is the only unique character and also happens to be pretty much the strongest datasheet right now. 435 points gets you a Questoris pattern knight with a general purpose Las Impulsor and Freedom's Hand in the Thunderstrike Gauntlet. For his fairly chunky stats, he just does far more than you might expect as well, hitting on a 2+ with sustained 5+, and also inbuilt knightly rerolls to turn those few results of a 1 into something good. Given the sustained hits melee, Freedom's Hand will often outfight a Gallant. Then he got even better in the data slate, as his command point thing now became a -1 command point to all stratagems and not just battle tactics, so you can use it to trigger rotate ion shields for free, or do free tank shock, or reroll charges, or epic challenge, or just literally reroll one of his damage dice as needed. There's loads of solid options. And he also gained that ability to basically just smash through big terrain pieces, so he's far harder to screen out, and potentially means that you can be a bit cagier with him and be able to hide him as well. He just really doesn't want to roll that 1 and get battle shocked, as that would stop his stratagems. Overall, really strong power compared with most of the knights. Again, not too surprising to see why it's in just about every army. Finally for the Imperium, we've got the Space Marine chapters, which I might rattle through just a little bit quicker. For the Blood Angels, I chose Lamates, 120 points for just a huge damage and defense buff for Death Company, which is one of their strongest units. Loads of solid HQs for them though. The Heroic Intervening Sanguinor, Captains and Sanguinary Priests to lead Intercessors, both jump and on the ground, or regular Chaplains for on the ground Death Company. For the Dark Angels, it kind of has to be Azrael at 105 points. Between generating command points, a 4+ invulnerable save, and sustained hits, he's just clearly one of the more undercosted datasheets in the game. Again, it's thoroughly auto-include. For the Black Templars, I chose High Marshal Helbrecht at 120 points. Immense melee stats with a sweep and strike mode that gets to the absolute next level when he's with Sword Brethren. He buffs the unit a little bit, but they buff him more, giving him +1 damage with his melee weapons. And then in Righteous Crusaders, you can flex into vows and things to take their damage output through the roof. Otherwise, the Emperor's Champion is just really cheap and really fighty. And probably worth mentioning the Turnhouse's Bones character in Righteous Crusaders as well. Giving a 5+ feel no pain to a unit is pretty big, maybe for a nice lieutenant to also give a damage buff. For the Space Wolves, I chose the Battle Leader on Thunderwolf for 80 points. I feel like for the points cost, he is perhaps one of the single biggest value ones for the points out of the Thunderwolf buffing contingent. Lethal hits for Thunderwolves is pretty handy given their lowest strength. He gets a Power Fist that gets the damage buff on the charge that Thunderwolves get, so damage 3 there, which is nasty. And a once per game reactive move for his units can be really big as well when you've got such a big threatening and annoying unit to try and take down. Otherwise for the Wolves I've mentioned Logan Grimnar, Thunderwolf, Wolf Lords as well, and maybe Bjorn the Fell-Handed, perhaps more so in Champions of Rust, a big tanky character with a bit of range damage. As new and improved command point debuff thing, it is rather handy. Finally, Deathwatch aren't going to be around too much longer unfortunately before being rolled into Agents of the Imperium, where they'll be competing against the Inquisitors. I guess out of their two unique choices, maybe I'd rank the Watchmasters first. They'd happily be in the thick of the fray, and debuffing enemy command points could be quite a big deal there. I still feel like he's a bit of a tall order at 105 points though. I'd probably be a bit more enthused by a character with the fairly savage tome of Ectoclades, or the free rapid ingress of the Beacon Angelus. Moving on to the Forces of Chaos next, and we'll start off with the Chaos Space Marines. I feel like these guys had a pretty obvious winner in just the standard Chaos Lord, pretty much carrying the HQ section from prior to the Codex and still doing that very much now. He also gets the reduced cost stratagem each battle round, so could be good in Renegade Raiders for things like their Armour of Contempt equivalent, or maybe Advance and Charge. He can get some pretty nasty rerolls on the go with Undivided in Pact Bound as well. And then beyond that, he just offers a massive amount of hard-hitting melee power, usually jumping out of a Rhino with either Legionaries or Chosen. His base damage is alright, with 5 attacks at Strength 8, AP 2 and Damage 2, with either a Power Fist or Hammer, buffed by Dark Pacts for either sustained hits or lethal hits. That goes next level though when he activates his once per game sort of Rage mode, going to 6 attacks at Strength 9, AP 3 and Damage 3, so easily capable of damaging a whole bunch of tougher vehicles or handing out hits to medium infantry. He can work really quite well leading either Chosen or Legionaries. Chosen are a bit more expensive but have more threat and can advance and charge innately. Legionaries are a bit cheaper, they get more objective control and they grant 4 rerolls to wound against things on objectives, which is kind of massive for the Lord, particularly against tougher targets, and even more so with the Demon Hammer. Beyond the Chaos Lord, Cypher would probably be my next choice. 90 points for maybe a slightly pricey but incredibly dangerous lone operative. He gets a whole bunch of plasma pistol and bolt pistol shots, both at range and then also when he charges into combat as well. Pretty nasty when you've got a lone operative, which is just helpful to have in the first place, but this one can easily solo entire squads of infantry. For the World Eaters, it kind of had to be the man himself in Angron. 415 points for the Demon Primarch, and pretty much an auto-include in the vast majority of competitive lists, leading the charge of Wanton Destruction. He's tough enough to soak up a whole bunch of enemy firepower, with 16 wounds at toughness 11, a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save. Terrifying melee damage with a big 9 attacks at strength 17, AP 4 and damage d6+2 on the charge, likely re-rolling all hit rolls from his boost unless he chooses something else, and maybe having other damage or defensive buffs from the blessings. Early in the game though, the movement blessings might be the best ones to go for. Being able to combine +2 to movement and an advance and charge could get him across the table a scary amount, and there's a stratagem for 1 command point to auto-advance 6 inches, which means that if the blessings turn up, then it means that you've got a 22-inch move and then can still charge after that, so basically the enemy can't really afford to just sit back and ignore him even for a turn. It usually means that they're going to have to do the work of actually bringing him down as soon as possible, otherwise he'll cause problems. And then from there, the World Eaters player, each time they roll a blessing, they can have a go at resurrecting him. If they happen to luck out with a 666, you've got 400 odd points of Scary Demon returning to the table, likely with +1 to charge when he comes in from that choice of his command ability. It's not going to happen in literally every game, but in the games that it does, it's going to be a massive swing. Otherwise, for my next pick, I'd go for Lord Invocatus, a nice scout move model that can move 8 bound forward very quickly if you need to, or do some objective things with Jackals early on, plus being a fairly capable melee threat in his own right and often run solo. For Death Guard, we've got the captain of the Harbingers in Typhus. 80 points for a very scary Terminator with a scythe, where it just feels like the damage and defense that he brings to the table is worth a fair bit more than 80 points. He hands out d6 mortal wounds on a 2+, and quite apart from anything else, a couple of turns of that going off could easily kill something in the region of 80 points against certain targets, but beyond that everything else he does is pretty good. 5 attacks in melee at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 3 with lethal hits. He'll often be AP 3 with those attacks given the contagions debuff, and always -1 toughness for the enemies, so wounding toughness 10 on a 4. He also has a sweep mode option as well if you happen to be against hordes. He's often seen leading Death Shroud, which are scary melee threats in their own right. He gives them -1 to hit when they're in melee, and his 5-inch movement can actually help them out a little bit given that they have a movement 4. Means that he'll often be ranging out the front and making charges just that tiny crucial bit shorter. He's fairly good with Poxwalkers or even just running solo. Basically at 80 points you literally can't really go wrong with him. Otherwise, beyond Typhus, I'd rate the Biologist Putrefier and the Foul Blightspawn, offering in tandem and buffing Plague Marines out of Rhinos. Fights first and a very scary amount of disturbing lethal hits with heavy plague weapons can make short work of a lot of targets out there. Though beyond them, most of the rest of the Death Guard HQ section is really quite usable. For Thousand Sons again, I'd have to hand it to their Demon Primarch Magnus the Red. 440 points, and tends to be the absolute linchpin of the majority of Thousand Sons army lists. He costs a massive amount of points, but he has a massive impact on the table, and can be kind of pivotal to victory or defeat. For positioning, he moves really quite fast at 14 inches. You could flex into a 2-inch move if desperately needed, or use the ritual to double move if you want to, which means that he could be swooping half the way across the table, all the way to the enemy's home objective if it made sense. Even potentially being a candidate for doing the secret mission to put a warlord on the home objective. For 440 points, I wouldn't say he's excessively tough for that cost, though he's definitely got a whole load of barriers to damage, and the enemy is still going to need probably a turn of most of their army focusing on him to bring him down. His toughness 11 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, usually activating his -1 damage buff, and then can potentially command point reroll or just blanker damage for 1 command point if needed. Then his own damage output is perhaps one of the biggest and most savage that anything in the Thousand Sons have, often being the thing that's needed to destroy extra tough targets in the enemy army. You can see his magical damage down on the bottom right hand corner here, between the gaze of Magnus with a whole bunch of strength 9 and damage 3 attacks, and Tzeentch's Firestorm for some follow-up infantry destroying stuff. He's really got quite a lot covered. He'll be +1 to hit and wound with that all the time, get the detachment rule for either sustained lethals or devastating wounds, and can get full rerolls on that psychic damage to turn it up to 11 for a 1 command point stratagem once more. You could also improve the AP with a Kabbalistic Ritual if you wanted. To chase that down, he's also got solid melee with a bunch of damage 3 attacks, and he's got the aura of buffing nearby psychic damage for +1 to hit and wound. Nice for any of the sorcerers out there, and extra good for Infernal Masters. Not hard to see why he's in just about every Thousand Sons competitive list right now. Though their HQ section is kind of overloaded for good choices really. Araman tends to be joining him with +1 to wound and his free ritual. Infernal Masters are pretty much auto-include for most armies too, some brutal torrent damage, and doubly so if they're joining a Rubik Marine unit which gets 4 rerolls to wound against objectives. Exalted Sorcerers are nice to be flying around slowing units and have their own damage, and a character with the Umbrellific Crystal can have some big options, either delivering Warp Flamers or doing shenanigans jumping around into the enemy deployment zone, perhaps to score objectives. Kind of appropriate that the Thousand Sons go Commander heavy though, as the Legion of Sorcerers. For the Chaos Knights, Games Workshop do need to sort themselves out a bit and make the big knights good. Currently the most common character datasheet to be included in the army tends to be the Wardog Stalker, 150 points for the sort of Wardog in chief. He's generally used for the armies that basically decide that the big knights aren't strong enough to break through in competitive. You might often have literally one Wardog Stalker leading up an entire roster of carnivores and brigands for their savage shooting and melee. The Stalker's definitely not a bad datasheet in its own right in any way though. It's got some good range and melee threat, and it's really customizable depending on whether you want just that little bit more anti-infantry or anti-tank, a little bit of indirect fire, and it gets a damage buff against isolated enemy units. For the actual Titanic Knights that people might want to have commanding the army though, perhaps the Chaos Knight Lancer might be one of the most standout currently. Moving fast, warping through walls, and hitting hard with tank shock and a whole bunch of melee, and then having a 4+ invulnerable save so it doesn't die to a stiff breeze in return. For other more playable ones, maybe the Rampager, the Desecrator, and the Atropos could be some of the most interesting, all usable enough, though unfortunately it does still seem that the majority of competitive lists are playing War Dogs. Finally for Chaos we have the Demons, and for these guys I still think that the Great Unclean One with the enhancement is slouching head and shoulders above the rest, just hilarious ridiculous levels of tankiness that can stomp towards the midfield and blast apart a bunch of sort of medium infantry type units. The Great Unclean Ones are quite cheap, 230 points at base, 260 with the enhancement. Just at base they're really chunky and hard to take down for that points cost. Toughness 12, 20 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save with a 6+ feel no pain. That's going to take some serious focal fire, and already it's probably at the point where it's borderline worth just ignoring as long as possible and trying to deal with everything else. With its enhancement Endless Gift for an extra 30 points though, it basically gets a 4+ feel no pain all the time now, as it's always in its own Shadow of Chaos, and that means on average enemies will need to chew through 40 wounds worth of Toughness 12 and 4+ invulnerable save, which is kind of obscene for 260 points. Basically nothing is going to kill this thing efficiently. Admittedly, its damage output isn't spectacular, though it isn't useless. It'll have some close-ish range attacks between the Vomit, Flail, and maybe a Bile Sword in close combat. Not going to be wiping out entire squads of enemy elites, but should be able to take a big chunk out of any lighter or sort of Space Marine equivalent type units, and lethal hits helps it out against other things. Beyond that, it can reduce the toughness of an enemy unit, which can have some nice synergy with other demon units that are better damage dealers. The Aura of Shadow has got loads of other applications, better stratagems, debuffing enemies, and even close range deep striking some Plague Bearers or something to stomp onto the midfield objectives, and a 6+ feel no pain for Nurgle units around it as well. Overall, it's hard to go too far wrong with pointing one of these tough things at a midfield objective and making it as painful as possible for the opponent to ignore it. Beyond the Great Unclean One though, most of the other greater demons are all pretty playable in their own ways. Maybe the Ren Master beyond them can be particularly nice to buff Khorne melee and just mark one unit for an extra savage beating with some Hellblades. Moving on, we've got the Forces of Xenos, and for the Aeldari we're starting out with the Autarch Wayleaper, 115 points at base for the lone operative Autarch that can jump around on a jump pack, rustling up command points as they go. Just having fast lone operatives tends to be really useful in 40k. They can screen out back sections of the board, fly around doing secondary objectives, or even score primaries that the opponent can't physically get to, as you won't be able to shoot them down at long range. Can be particularly helpful to go for that in the later game. Before that though, they can lie low for a bit, farming up one command point per turn to plug into some powerful Aeldari stratagems. And if and when they do find themselves actually in combat with enemy units, the Starglaive can have some fairly punchy melee, the Fusion Gun can have an accurate Melter 3 shot, which could have a pretty good chance of hitting and wounding with Battle Host rerolls. I've seen maybe a bit more variation on the headgear, either a Banshee mask to fight first, or Manda Blasters for some devastating wounds in melee if it makes sense. Fights first is pretty disruptive if you need to destroy him in melee though. Then finally a lot of armies shell out for the Phoenix Gem, even if it does take him to a fairly pricey 150 points. That's the one that gives you a very good chance to just stand up on death. That's a really disruptive ability to have on a lone operative, as it means that you basically need to shoot him down in the shooting phase and then charge him in melee if you want to destroy him in one turn. Otherwise he's going to be able to stand back up, get away, and either rustle up a few more victory points or destroy some units before he goes down. Otherwise for the Aeldari HQs, both the Farseers have some interesting buffs on the go, and automatic 6 Fate dice can be really nice with things like D-cannons. It Rain's a really common pick in army lists with a pretty great anti-infantry attack accompanying some Harlequins, and unlocks Inari for a bunch of Drukhari with Battle Host rerolls and other fun synergies, and plenty of the other things are really quite usable. From an Aeldari commander to a Drukhari one, next up we have the Archon, a fairly cheapish 75 point HQ that's perhaps most commonly seen joining Incubi, even if the other attachment options can definitely do work as well. And his primary buff is to give his squad reroll wound rolls when his unit's empowered, and that's quite a savage buff given that when you're empowered you already reroll the hit roll and get an extra AP -1 buff in melee. It can turn him and a squad of Incubi into an absolute blender that's a threat to just about anything in the game, particularly when they're charging in out of a transport with Lance. Incubi have enough of a general purpose, good AP, good damage weapon to be able to work with that, and they can run across the battlefield extra fast after charging out of a Raider or Venom using the move drop charge stratagem for one command point. To get in there, occasionally people use the Nightmare Shroud. Ignoring Overwatch can be a really big deal for Drukhari, given a fairly fragile toughness 3 unit where every model is going to hit big, and when he's in combat his personal stats do add something. He gets anti-infantry melee and a further bunch of AP2 damage 2 attacks, and his 2+ save Shadow Field sometimes can do absolutely great. It certainly can fail super early, but on other times he'll just tank a massive amount of damage, and it's disruptive for the enemy shooting, not knowing exactly how much damage they'll need to do to bring him down. His command point debuff was really quite a big addition in the data slate as well. He adds +1 to the cost of command points within 12 inches of him, and that just seems like it's very likely to be in a good position these days. He'll likely be charging off with his unit and destroy something critical to the enemy, and then likely kind of exposed to a counter-attack, messing with the enemy's options as they use command points. For other Drukhari HQs, I'd probably next go for the Beastmaster, a really quite strong scouting disruption unit to seize the mid-board early. Lilith Hesperats can be another very good melee blender with a unit of witches, a little bit cheaper than the Archon and Incubi 10 squad, well capable of doing a very similar thing with a crazy flurry of damage 1 attacks. For the Tyranids, I feel like they're one of the factions I had the most difficulty picking an outright winner with. They've just got a lot of HQs that are really quite strong right now. Maybe if I had to go literally just for one of them, I feel like the Neurotyrant is really going to be a bad choice for Tyranids, kind of regardless of which detachment that you're playing. It's 105 points for a cheapish, toughish monster, often being placed in the backfield with its torrent to repel interlopers that try and take the home objective, and then having some nice synaptic buffs to be able to hand that out to longer range than normal, and that became a lot more powerful given that it gives you the +1 strength as well now. On top of that, it just gives you a very nice buff to Shadow in the Warp with an extra -1. That would give units quite a significantly high chance of failing their leadership test with that, and it's perhaps particularly powerful in Synaptic Nexus, given that you can give it a really cheap enhancement to make its torrents a lot more dangerous. In the latest data slate as well, you also gain the option to lead Zoanthropes, which would be quite a different use for it. You can give them all +1 to hit with their scary Warp Lances, potentially +1 to wound as well if the enemy's battle shocks that they're targeting, and I think rules as written give them big guns never tire right now, even if I feel like that's maybe a bit of a quirk of the way that it's worded, as opposed to something that was really intended by GW. Otherwise though, depending on the detachment, there's loads of strong stuff. Hive Tyrants for 210 or 235 points are both nice. Being able to get a discounted stratagem in both your turn and the enemy turn, and getting that on any Tyranids unit within 12 inches is enormous, even if they do have a big price of entry. Then the on-foot one gets a bit more raw might and lethal hits and assault. The winged one debuffs enemy melee and gets the Vanguard Invader keyword, which is big for Vanguard Onslaught. It's not bad that they got a strength 10 melee weapon as well after the Synapse buff to them. Otherwise, Brood Lords are nasty, and particularly in Vanguard Onslaught, 80 points for strength 5 Genestealers with devastating wounds become far more threatening than when they're strength 4. And probably throwing a shout for the Death Leaper as well, 80 points for a spooky and tough Lictor variant with fights first, and an ability that allows you to put battle shock test on things that have just had chip damage happen against them, which can be really quite an annoying ability if you can manage to survive with cover on a midfield objective. Next up, for the Genestealer Cults, I feel like there's a bit less consensus as to what best to do with them in the competitive game right now. Lists that I've seen do tend to have been doing really quite different things with very different detachments, and there's not really a lot of data as to what works well, though a few characters maybe seem to be included more than most. Perhaps just for one obvious source of power, I'll go for a Primus with the Host of Ascension and a chink in their armour. A fairly straightforward and obvious one that provides the Genestealer Cult rank and file with some pretty scary damage numbers. The Primus's core buff is to give you reroll to hit, and that's really quite nice to amp up neophyte damage, usually taking 2 seismic cannons, 2 mining lasers, a couple of grenade launchers, some webbers and small arms now. That'll add way more hits once they come in from reserve, getting sustained hits 1 from the detachment rule and ignore cover. And then the chink in their armor enhancement also grants you lethal hits as well, helping them punch up against tough stuff. Then you can use a 1 command point stratagem to give them criticals on a 5+, and then reroll everything that isn't a 5+, so every result of a 5 or more gives you both a sustained and a lethal hit. Again, a pretty good recipe for success against anything that you're fighting against, all ignoring cover with the detachment rule when they turn up, and likely with an extra AP -1 on all guns from a friendly Ridge Runner nearby. Overall, it's a fairly savage damage combo and maybe one of the more obvious ones for Genestealer Cults, Beyond that, he does have a lot of value as well, allowing redeploys and putting more things in strategic reserve if he'd like to. He makes his units Overwatch far better with full rerolls to hit, so you're averaging near enough double the amount of 6s as you would be otherwise. His melee damage really isn't terrible for the cost against infantry, and he's also got a few other good combos with other detachments as well. He's a central character for Xenocreed, and he has a fun one in Brood Brothers as well. Beyond the Primus though, perhaps for other standout ones, the Biophagus is really good, lethal hits in melee, and he can do work in plenty of detachments with Aberrants or Acolytes. And for lone operatives, the Kellamorph has gained in popularity a lot post-Codex, annoying to catch up with, fairly cheap, and actually having some fairly nasty shooting damage compared with before. Next up, for the scariest Space Dwarf in Chief, I've chosen to rank the Ironhair Champion. I feel like pretty much all the Leagues of Votann characters are usable enough, but I'd say that he stands out at his current 60 points. A 5 wound toughness 6 character with a 2+ save, usually with a 4+ invulnerable from his Weaverfield crest as well, and just adding a whole load of damage dealing to his Ironhair Hearthguard unit, often with a mass hammer for 3 attacks, hitting on a 3+, a strength 12 AP2 and damage D6+1. A bit more reliably scary against big tanks and vehicles than the concussion gauntlets and things. He also will usually get D3 mortal wounds on the charge, though he could spike a bit higher if he gets lucky. The Darkstar Axe is a bit better against medium infantry, though in general it seems like most people prefer the Mass Hammer. I do think it's probably the better of the two, given it just gives them a bit more bite against really tough targets when they've usually already got quite a lot of damage against medium infantry with concussion gauntlets and things already. Besides sheer melee threat, he also gets reroll charges for his unit, which is handy for getting them into battle when they're charging out of Deep Strike or out of a Land Fortress. They're not enormously fast when they're on the board either. And he's also a nice cheap character to get the useful Votann enhancements into a threatening place, potentially the one where his unit wipes out an enemy unit to redistribute judgment, or marking a central objective where everything counts as 1 judgment token higher. As mentioned though, I feel like all the rest of the characters are pretty usable. Maybe Uthar a little bit lesser taken than most, though even he I think is far less bad than he was after they reduced the points a couple of times. For the Necrons, perhaps with the Tyranids, I feel like they're one of the armies where people genuinely seem to use really quite a lot of different HQ choices, and there's really quite a lot of style and variation between different army lists and different detachments, though maybe with just a few choices that are lesser picks than most. I feel like Games Workshop, after the updates, have genuinely done a good job of balancing them quite well. Just for one focal one to look at, I decided to go for the Chronomancer, who I still think is a really useful buffing character at 65 points, though a little bit less standout than he was before. He gives -1 to hit for his lead unit, which is always helpful to keep some immortals alive and kicking, and then his other buff is Move Shoot Move, which can allow them to get up the board really quite a lot faster and onto midfield objectives if needed, and kind of big with Hypercrypt as he could be redeploying them around the place, potentially deep striking them or coming in from strategic reserves at the edges, and then allowing them to move closer with his second reactive move type thing. If playing a little bit less aggressive with them as well, you could just have them behind terrain, pop out, rinse a whole bunch of stuff with some Tesla fire on midfield objectives, and then retreat to safety. Beyond that though, there's so much good stuff. Illuminor Zeraz can boost Immortals with extra AP and debuffs. The Plasmancer is a really solid damage dealer character, maybe with Arisen Tyrant in Hypercrypt in particular. The Hexmark Destroyer is a powerful Necron lone operative, again really helpful in Hypercrypt for warping around, this time grabbing secondary objectives and things. It can still skirmish with enemy lighter infantry well as well. The Silent King gets a lot more play than he used to. Big ignores modifiers, spooky stats, and again can be hyperphasing if you want to. The Locust Lord can be nasty with Locust Destroyers for a bunch more lethal hits. Imitate the Stormlord has a fair bit of raw might and command points. The Technomancer is going to be also include great if you're playing Canoptek Court or running any Wraiths. And I guess the Catan are also characters as well, if you count them as well. Then they're still very, very strong indeed, even if they're not exactly what you'd call leaders and are forbidden for being the Warlord. Lots of options seem pretty viable on the table for the Necrons at the moment. For the Tau Empire, again I'd say there's plenty of stuff that works really well. For them again I would say it's very detachment dependent. Maybe the Cadra Fireblade is a particularly standout one though far more so in Montcar and Cao Yon, at least compared with Retaliation Cadra. His primary buff is adding +1 shots to Devilfish Breaches, move them into the midfield, jump out with the Pulse Blasts at close range, and absolutely go to town on whatever they can reach. Just for their core damage output, that'll be 30 Pulse Blaster shots, lightly guided for hitting on a 3+, maybe re-rolling ones with a stealth team, ignoring cover with a marker light, and then re-rolling wound rolls against anything on objectives, maybe with lethal hits with Montcar, where they also have an extra AP stratagem on offer as well. If you stack all the damage output for them up to the sky, they can be one-rounding battle tanks with relative ease. Besides that, he also has his own shooting, a few high-powered pulse rifle shots with some extra AP on critical wounds, plus his ability will also help any gun drones in the unit as well. Sometimes he can be a cheap character if you need something to bear an enhancement, and it doesn't matter too much where it is as well, though I think he works fine just on his own. Otherwise, for solid contenders for the Tau Top Commander, I think Shadow Sun would probably be mentioned for being a scary lone operative with some good anti-tank, plus some nice buffing rules. Both flavours of Crisis Commander are really nice, and maybe have a slight leaning towards the Cold Star over the Enforcer, but if you want to drop threats, then the Enforcer is fine. And for special characters, both Dark Strider and Farsight are usable. Finally, we have some greenskins with the Orks, and for this one, I'm really not going to be able to give this to anything else other than the War Boss. 65 points for his stats and his abilities is a really nice deal, plus being able to lead both Knobs and Boys, which are quite good units in their own right. His core boost is giving you a +1 to hit for his units, which is scary for Knobs, who usually hit on a 4+, very good for Boys as well, and then contributes to them being able to actually take down tough things like battle tanks, 4 attacks at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 2 normally, but boosted to a big 9 attacks at strength 11, AP 2 and damage 2 in the turn of the war. There is that annoying FAQ though that means that you need to think about disembarking him out of any transport he's in before you call it. I feel like that was a really weird decision to stop him from using that if he started the turn embarked. Hopefully a truck or something will be able just to deposit him and his unit safely behind terrain. Talking of which, he could use trucks or battle wagons to get him there into the fight, and it's a datasheet that's just really relevant in a whole bunch of detachments. Warhorde will do nicely with extra greenskin might, Green Tide to lead up boys squads and be able to punch down some tougher stuff, and certainly in Bully Boys where the Knob squad is one of the central units that can use the double war and the stratagems and things. Besides the War Boss, the big boss himself in Ghazghkull Thraka is a scary force on the tabletop. Snickrot's a powerful lone operative for jumping around doing secondaries. Both the Beast Boss on foot and the Beast Boss on Squigosaur are rather nice, and if you happen to be playing Green Tide, then Pain Boys and Weird Boys are both going to be well worth the price of includes. I'll throw in a shout for the Shockadat gun mech in Dreadmob as well. Him with a bunch of looters and some Git Finder goggles can put out some serious DACA. In any case though, let me know what you make of all these captains and commanders. What would you rate as the strongest character for your faction in Warhammer 40k right now? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. As mentioned before, a big thank you for Baron of Dice for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check out the link down in the video description if you'd like some custom dice that could be helpful to adding a bit of theme to a model army. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all of these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.